Hello, friends. I hope you're fine today and that you're ready for listening to another chapter from Japanese Studies in Britain. Today, I have the great pleasure and privilege of reading, with the author's permission, Jim Hoare's chapter 3, from the book. So let me just quickly share the relevant page, which shows the context. So we've got, so far I have read chapter 1, A Brief History of Japanese Studies in Britain from the 1860s to the 21st Century, by Peter Kornicki. That was quite a long chapter. And then chapter 2, by Professor Hamish Iron, British Missionaries and Japanese Studies in Pre-War Japan. And today it's number 3, British Consular and Military Officers in Japan before 1941 by J.E. Hoare, or James Edward Hoare, or Jim Hoare, as I've come to know him over many years of acquaintance. So without further ado, I'm now going to use the search facility within the PDF to go to the start of the chapter. So as you can see, I've got his family name here in the search box. So well, actually, the next one, quite conveniently, gives his biography. So I think I'll read that right now. So James Hoare joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office Research Cadre in 1969 and has a PhD from SOAS 1971. He retired as a research counselor in 2003. He served in Seoul and Beijing and was chargé d'affaires in Pyongyang after Britain established diplomatic relations with North Korea. So he was, so to speak, our man in North Korea, a rather unique post. He has been president of the Korea branch of the Royal Asiatic Society and of the British Association for Korean Studies. He has published a number of books on East Asia, most recently Historical Dictionary of the Republic of Korea, 2015, and he edited Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, Volume 3, 1999. Well, Volumes 1 and 2 were edited by Professor Ian Nish, and volumes from 4 to 10 were edited by Sir Hugh Cortazzi. Right, so let's move on to the chapter. So there are various references to him. And there we are. There's the start of the chapter. So we can get rid of the search box now and begin. But before I do, I should like to just mention how much Dr. Hoare has helped me with my Ernest Sato research, and he's also written quite a number of the forwards to the published letters, especially the semi-official letters from Sato to London when he was in Japan and China and this kind of thing. So I owe him a personal debt, and it's my pleasure and privilege and honor to read this chapter with his permission, his kind permission, which I received recently. All right, so here we go. Chapter 3, British Consular and Military Officers in Japan before 1941. J.E. Hoare, the Consular Service. At the time of the opening of Japan in the 1850s, Britain had 3 consular services. The General Service operated in most of the world. Older and better regarded was the Levant Service, covering parts of the Near and Middle East. Its staff were systematically recruited, properly paid, exercised jurisdiction over their countrymen, and some at least were expected to know the local languages. The China Consular Service that emerged in the 1840s resembled the Levant Service rather than the General Service. The 1842 Treaty of Nanjing, opened 5 ports for trade and residence with a consulate at each. The need for efficient communication led to a professional Chinese-speaking consular service. By 1858, the China service had developed a structure that would survive until the 1940s. Senior positions in the service were no longer filled by missionaries and other outsiders with a knowledge of the language, but by officers who qualified as interpreters. There were proper salaries and allowances during an officer's employment and a pension at the end. And the rules against trading were strictly enforced. This was the model for the Japan service. In the early years in China, the availability of missionaries and others filled the gap until a professional cadre could be trained. Japan had remained more isolated, however, and there were few Westerners who had any knowledge of the language. The person with probably the best Japanese was based in the Ryukyu Islands, the Okinawan Islands, but seemed to be unhinged by the mid-1850s. Members of the China Consular Service studied Japanese, but the only one who had made real progress died in 1851. Harry Parkes, later minister in Tokyo, had tried, but had not advanced far. From the start, therefore, it was assumed that there would be a need to train language staff. In preparation for the opening of Japan to foreign residents, several university colleges were approached in 1854 for nominations. Those selected went to Hong Kong as supernumerary interpreters. It is not clear if any went to Japan. Instead, A.J. Gower, private secretary to Sir John Bowring, the superintendent of the China trade, was assigned to Japan as it was understood, I think that should be, that he had directed his attention to Japanese. Whatever Gower's language abilities, they proved no match for reality. He proved incapable of running the legation or learning Japanese and retired in 1874 with general good wishes. At first, reliance was placed on Dutch-speaking staff. Dutch was the only Western language widely known in Japan, and it was widely believed to be some form of lingua franca. 4 Dutch speakers were selected: A. Ansley, C.F. Maibara, F.M. Cowan, and Richard Euston. Martin Doman, a supercargo on a Dutch ship, later joined them. Another Dutch-speaking Briton, J.J. Ensley, was appointed in 1861. Cowan died in the autumn of 1860, Maibara in 1869. The others stayed, even though it was obvious that officers who understood Japanese would be essential. Now we have 2 footnotes, which I will read. I just need to make them a bit larger to read them. 1. D.C.M. Platt, the Cinderella Service, British consuls since 1825, London, Longmans, 1871. P.D. Coates, the China consuls, British consular officers, 1843 to 1943, Hong Kong, Oxford University Press, 1988. For Japan, C.J.E. Hoare, Britain's Japan Consular Service, 1859 to 1941, in Ian Nish edited Britain and Japan Biographical Portraits, Volume 2, Richmond, Surrey, Japan Library, 1997, pages 94 to 106, 350 to 353, where full references will be found. Footnote number 2, W.G. Beasley, The Language Problem in the Anglo-Japanese Negotiations of 1854, Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies, 13, 1950, pages 746 to 758. Okay, and returning to the main text, the others stayed, even though it was obvious that officers who understood Japanese would be essential. As early as 1861, Alexander von Siebold, 1846 to 1911, who had reached Japan in 1859 with his father, was employed as a supernumerary interpreter because he had learnt Japanese. Ernest Sato, joining the legation in 1862, found that Euston, although designated the Japanese secretary, knew not a word of Japanese, yet was supposed to provide language supervision for the students. Very bizarre situation. In 1867, a consular post was found for him, and Sato took over as Japanese secretary. The other Dutch interpreters served on, although their lack of Japanese was a barrier to promotion. Ansley eventually left to become consul at Réunion and then at Portland, Maine. Only Ensley, who passed an oral examination in 1878, made any attempt to learn Japanese. He never qualified in the written language, and that plus other issues blocked his promotion prospects. The need for Japanese was clear. Few Japanese had any knowledge of English, and the consular officers had to conduct business in the local language. Soon the rule against no promotion without a language qualification was strictly enforced. Those recruited in 1861 were sent to China initially, since Rutherford Alcock, the first British minister in Japan, believed this would help them with Japanese. Urgent need cut short the experiment, which was not repeated, and Ernest Sato, R.A. Jamieson, and Russell Robertson set out for Japan in August 1862. Jamieson left at Shanghai to become a newspaperman. The other two arrived in Japan to find that there were no arrangements for teaching them. Western books on Japanese were few, out of date, and not easily obtained in Yokohama. There were no teachers and no funds to pay for them. The students had to devise their own methods. At first they worked on their own, but were eventually allowed to employ the American missionary, the Reverend S.R. Brown, for 2 hours a week at public expense. A Japanese teacher was also provided at public expense. They paid for a second themselves. And there are footnotes here, 2 footnotes. Footnote number 3, see J.E. Hoare, Mr. Ensley's Grievances, the Consul, the Ainu, and the Bones, Japan Society of London, Bulletin, number 78, March 1976, pages 14 to 19. Number 4, footnote number 4, that is, E.M. Sato, a diplomat in Japan, An Inner History of the Japanese Reformation, London 1922, reprinted Rutland, Vermont, Tuttle, 1983, pages 55 to 56. Brown's daughter married J.F. Lauder, another member of the Consular Service. J.E. Hoare, John Frederick Lauder, 1843 to 1902, Consul, Council, and Oyatoi, in Hugh Kotatsi, edited Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, Volume 10, Folkestone, Kent, Renaissance Books. Yeah, Oyatoi is an employed foreigner in the Japanese language. Oyatoi Gaikokujin in full. All right, let's move on to next page. Time for study proved difficult. Sato may have had it in writing that his task was to learn Japanese, but the prevalent view before the days of typewriters was that the best way to learn about current issues was by copying out dispatches and notes. It took much effort to persuade his seniors otherwise. As late as 1885, the British Foreign Office expressed concern that constables rather than junior consular staff were doing the copying. The minister successfully argued that it gave the former something to do, while allowing the latter to keep up their Japanese. For some years, consular staff continued to acquire Japanese by puzzling out the language with books and a Japanese teacher, a method Sato remained wedded to for the rest of his life. And very effective it was in his case too. By June 1863, he could provide an adequate translation of a Japanese document. In 1865, on the recommendation of the new minister, Sir Harry Parkes, he was appointed as interpreter for the Japanese language with a salary of £400 per annum, double that of a student, but less than that of the senior Dutch interpreter, the Japanese secretary. When Eusden finally moved in 1868, he was the Japanese secretary, and then he moved in 1868, Sato took over with a salary of £700. In status, he ranked with but after the diplomatic second secretaries. Passing the interpreter's examination and moving on to an assistant's post, however, was no easy task, and it was never achieved in the 2 years allowed. Even though copying gave way to more modern methods, there were always other requirements which took the student interpreters away from their main task. Yet, having passed the examination, officers were not required to requalify, and there was concern that they would sit on their laurels or devote their leisure to dissipation and extravagance. In the early 1860s, more systematic arrangements were in operation for recruitment. A.B. Mitford, later Lord Redesdale, a diplomatic service officer, told a commission of inquiry in 1870 that student interpreters in China and Japan were of a higher class than dragomen, interpreters in the Levant. So 2 footnotes. Footnote 5, Sato, diplomat in Japan, pages 55 to 56. National Archives, FO 97/582. Plunkett to Salisbury, number 25, Consular, 24th of July, 1885. All subsequent references to the Foreign Office papers in the National Archives will be given with their FO reference alone. And so not referring to National Archives. Footnote number 6, FO 262/256. Tenterden to Parks, number 25, Consular, 4th of September, 1874. All right, let's return to the main text. I'll start again at the beginning of that paragraph. In the early 1860s, more systematic arrangements were in operation for recruitment. A.B. Mitford, later Lord Redesdale, a diplomatic service officer, told a commission of inquiry in 1870 that student interpreters in China and Japan were of a higher class than dragoman interpreters in the Levant. Young gentlemen who came out principally from the Irish universities. Asked if they were of the same class as diplomatic attaches, Mitford said they were not. The first Civil Service Commissioner put it more gently in 1914. Recruits for the Far Eastern Consular Services were like diplomats, but not so highly qualified. In fact, the social origins of entrance to the Japan service were firmly middle to upper class, and educational levels were high. Irish universities and schools were indeed well represented, but so were other areas, including occasionally Oxford and Cambridge. After 2 years, students became assistants. There were 3 assistant grades at £300, £350, and £400 respectively. In addition, an allowance of £100 was paid up to 6 officers who had passed the interpreter's examination. Parkes drew up a training scheme in 1870 under which third-class assistants spent 1 year at the court at Kanagawa, Yokohama, for legal training, and 1 year at a consulate for practical experience. That's the law court, of course. At junior levels, office hours could be long, a minimum of 5 or 6 hours a day, and an assistant's lot was not exciting. At the senior levels, staff had a much less exacting schedule, sometimes as little as 2 hours a day. Apart from the ubiquitous copying, there was much translation. Parkes discouraged the Japanese from writing in English, and it was not until his departure that such communications were generally accepted. Plunkett, Parkes' successor, noted in 1885 that a first assistant kept accounts, prepared dispatches and letters to the Japanese authorities, kept the land and other registers, undertook notary acts, and might act as judge. Junior assistants looked after the Japanese language archives, prepared translations, registered claims, and copied the outward letters and dispatches. Each level took 2 to 3 years. An officer then became a vice-consul or, if good at the language, assistant Japanese secretary. It normally took at least 10 years to become consul. Some took longer. Periods as acting consul softened the blow of delayed promotion. Footnote 7, report from the Select Committee on Diplomatic and Consular Services, Parliamentary Papers, House of Commons, PPHC, 1870, 382, 7, pages 300 to 301. Minutes of evidence, fifth report of the Royal Commission on the Civil Service, PPHC, 1914 to 1916, Command 7749, Q 38820. 38,820, I don't know. It should be Q 38820, I suppose. And footnote 8, Hoare, Britain's Japan Consular Service, 1859 to 1941. That's the chapter in Biographical Portraits already referred to in this paper, or in this chapter, I should say. Next page. Language training continued to dominate. Although the Japanese secretary argued for better teachers as early as 1910, new recruits were left without guidance and expected to teach the teachers how to teach, just as in the 1860s. Before a commission of inquiry in 1913, Sato, in retirement, argued that there was no other way. In 1933, George Sansom, the commercial counselor, and W.B. Cunningham, the Japanese secretary, both good linguists, argued the same. The Foreign Office thought this was complacent. It was true that the language skills of many officers attracted praise, and officers such as Sansom and Colin Davidson were admired for their excellent Japanese. Yet others found difficulty in meeting the standards. Esler Nenning, son of a missionary with good spoken Japanese and a post-war ambassador to Tokyo, had not passed the examination after 10 years. One particular hurdle was the requirement of a serious study of some aspect of Japan, not unlike a modern master's thesis. Working in Tokyo or Yokohama might make this a relatively easy task. Further away, with the demands of the job pressing, many complained that they had not been able to qualify only because they had failed to complete this task. No new system had been devised by 1941. Nobody drew any lesson from the fact that British language students after 4 years were failing to reach a standard others did in 2. Japan was a difficult place to live, especially in the early years. It was remote and there was the fear of assassination. Local communities were small and faction-ridden. Consular officers found themselves the targets of local jealousies and tensions to which they sometimes contributed. There was much sickness, some mental breakdowns, and early deaths. Hyogo, Kobe, Nagasaki, Niigata, and Yokohama were unhealthy posts and attracted added years for superannuation purposes. There's a footnote here. Footnote number 9, Minutes of Evidence. Report of the Committee on Oriental Studies in London, PPHC, 1909, Command 4561, 35, Q.470, FO 369/308, Sir C. MacDonald, that's Sir Claude MacDonald, to Lord Grey, number 4 Consular, 5th January 1910, FO 369/595/42565, Sir C. Green to Consular Department, semi-official, 19th August 1913, FO 369/2151/K2207, Minutes, 3rd of February 1930, FO 369/2323/K4122, Correspondence and Minutes, 1933. For an approach more akin to modern teaching, see Richard Bradford, Learning the Enemy's Language, U.S. Navy Officer Language Students in Japan, 1920 to 1941, International Journal of Navy History, Volume 1, Number 1, April 2002, and I shall not read that URL, just there it is. It's a PDF anyway, accessed 2nd of February 2016. Returning to the main text. Most officers left well before the official retiring age of 70, later 65. Few questions were asked about the medical reasons offered. After 1900, new posts were added. In 1895, Japan acquired Taiwan, where Britain had a consulate. Dairen Dalian in the Liaotsung Peninsula was added in 1905. Japanese call that Ryoto Hanto, Liaotsung Peninsula. And Seoul and Chemulpo in Korea in 1910, Manila 1903 and Honolulu 1904 were also added to the Japan service to improve career prospects. But they were a mixed blessing. It was not easy to keep up Japanese, and different terms of service applied. Yes, indeed. If you're in Korea, how do you keep up your Japanese? Or indeed China. Promotion remained slow. Economic constraints in the 1920s and 1930s hit hard, both in reductions in salaries and in the poor physical environment in which staff worked. The consular premises at Yokohama, destroyed in the 1923 earthquake, were not rebuilt until the late 1920s, and the consular residence not until 1937. There were long delays in providing new accommodation in Tokyo after 1923. At Kobe, the poor state of the consulate was a standing joke. There were battles over minor improvements. Like other specialized services, the Japan service was creaking to a halt. Reports and committees concluded that the solution was amalgamation, which came in 1932. China remained outside the amalgamated service. After 1934, other consular staff would be recruited to one service. The new arrangements had barely begun when a new war threw everything into chaos. After the war, the Japan Consular Service was no more, but several former members continued involvement with Japan as members of a united diplomatic service. Where did scholarship fit into all this? The general ethos of treaty port society laid a heavy emphasis on sport, horse riding, and other robust pursuits. Students were advised to bring sporting equipment with them. Studying, even for those officially employed to do so, was not highly regarded. Yet it was not surprising that some among a group of well-educated young men with little else to do would turn to intellectual occupations. Under Alcock and his temporary replacements, there was little encouragement, although Alcock himself would eventually be a prolific writer on things Japanese, even producing a guide to Japanese grammar. Footnote number 10, Platt, Cinderella Service, pages 221, et sec, and the following pages, in other words. All right. The new service was too young and its members too taken up with the need to acquire language skills to have time to produce learned papers. After 1868, the situation changed. There was a new minister, Harry Parkes, who had tried his hand at learning Japanese in Shanghai in the 1840s. Parkes, who had been neither to a public school nor to university, was no scholar, but he was interested in scholarly work and encouraged his staff to take it up. So too did the Japanese secretary Ernest Sato. Sato was an assiduous scholar who had published translations from Japanese and encouraged his charges to follow his example, both as students and when they moved on to more regular work. He was regularly disappointed at their unwillingness to do so. There was another stimulus that would play a major role in encouraging scholarship. By the 1860s, the London-based Royal Asiatic Society had branches in places further east. Parkes had been active in the North China branch in Shanghai, for example. The idea of a Japanese branch came up in 1866, soon after Parkes moved to Japan, but came to nothing. Revived in 1872, mainly under the auspices of American missionaries, but with active British participation, the idea took off, although early on it was noted that it was not a good idea to organize meetings around the time of the races. Horse races, that is. Oh. In deference to American susceptibilities, the Yokohama branch of the Royal Asiatic Society quickly became Asiatic Society of Japan, which it still remains today. And in the past, I've had a great deal of benefit from being a member of the Asiatic Society of Japan, including presenting to that body. Members of the British diplomatic and consular services played a prominent role in the new society. Its historian places Parkes at the head of this group, noting that if he had not been in London awaiting the Iwakura mission, he would have chaired the early meetings. So footnotes, number 11, Douglas Moore Kenrick, A Century of Western Studies of Japan, The First 100 Years of the Asiatic Society of Japan, 1872 to 1972, Transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan, third series, 14, 1978, pages 70 to 73. Parkes made 2 unpublished presentations. Footnote 12, John Carey Hall, among Sato's earliest students, was a disappointment for his failure to produce work on the pre-modern Japanese legal system until long after Sato had retired. J. E. Hoare, John Carey Hall, 1844 to 1921, A Career in Japan, 1868 to 1913, and the Japan Consular Service in Kotatsu edited Britain and Japan Biographical Portraits, Volume 10. Footnote number 13, Far East, Volume 6, 1874 to 75, page 286. Kenrick, A Century of Western Studies of Japan, pages 38 to 50. Hoare, Japan's Treaty Ports, pages 44 to 46. A similar society organized in Korea in 1900 with many American members remains the Korea branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. Returning to the main text. Right, he would have chaired the early meetings. That's Parkes. Instead, the chargé d'affaires, R.G. Watson, became the first president for a relatively brief period. When Parkes returned to Japan in 1873, he and W.G. Aston, who had also accompanied the Iwakura mission in Britain, joined the society. This is the ASJ, Asiatic Society of Japan. Aston would become a leading figure. By 1873, some of his translations from the Japanese had already appeared in British government publications. His short grammar of the Japanese spoken language, published in 1869, had gone into several editions, including a French translation. Sato was also involved in the founding of the ASJ, by the way. There were other outlets for scholarly or quasi-scholarly papers on Japan, but the Asiatic Society and its transactions were the first wholly dedicated to Japan. British officials were major contributors. Both Sato and Aston had papers in the first set of transactions, and both were to be prolific contributors in later years. Sato's total was 21 as sole author, and one jointly with F.V. Dickens. In fact, my first paper, or it might be my only published paper in the transactions, is one about Sato's Japanology, which includes all those papers. Aston contributed 19 as sole author and one joint paper. Two other members of the Consular Service, J.H. Gubbins and J.C. Hall, contributed 6 each. Parkes's nephew, T.R. McClatchy, wrote 5 and J.J. Troop 4. Others contributed between 1 and 3 papers. Some of these were probably based on the interpreter's exam essays. They covered a wide range of subjects, with much on literature, archaeology, history, and legal studies, both past and present. Not all were scholarly, and neither were they all published, nor were they confined to Japan. The society was willing to hear travel accounts, and Korea and China occasionally featured. British officials served as officers of the society, with the British minister or one of his colleagues as president. So, in fact, Sato, who was British minister in Japan from 1895 to 1900, was ex officio president of the Asiatic Society of Japan during that time. The number of papers by British officials dropped away from about 1914 onwards, as work demands intensified with the war and the increased use of the telegraph. Only G.B. Sansom kept up the tradition, producing 12 papers between 1910 and 1941, with one after retirement in 1950. Involvement in running the society did not diminish, however. British ambassadors after 1902 still took the presidency and even produced papers. Footnote 14, P.F. Cornicky, William George Aston in H. Cortazzi and G. Daniels, edited Britain and Japan 1859 to 1991, Themes and Personalities, London, Routledge, 1991, pages 64 to 75. Yeah, that was before the Britain and Japan Biographical Portraits series began. It's kind of a prototype, I think, for that. And footnote 15, D.M. Kenrick, A Century of Western Studies of Japan, Tokyo, Asiatic Society of Japan, 1978, pages 346 to 446, gives the details. In addition, several officers published papers elsewhere in the proceedings of societies such as the London Royal Asiatic Society, the Japan Society of London, now the Japan Society, the Royal Geographical Society, and many others. These included papers on linguistics and history and the geography of Japan and the Japanese Empire. After the establishment of the Korea branch of the Royal Asiatic Society in 1900, several members of the Japan Consular Service who served there contributed papers to its meetings and transactions, and also served as council members and officers. As mentioned, Rutherford Alcock, wrote a number of works about Japan, including his 2-volume account of his time in the country, The Capital of the Tycoon, which appeared in 1863. So the Japanese word was tycoon, and that became tycoon in English. In 1878, he published Art and Industries of Japan. Aston had published his first grammar in 1869. He went on to produce another in 1872, which also went into several editions. The 1870s and 1880s saw Korea take a major role in his life as the first resident British official in 1884. This interest led to several papers on the Korean language. After a brief period as Japanese secretary, he retired on health grounds in 1889. But his main work was still to come in the form of a translation of the Nihon Shoki, Chronicles of Japan, in 1896, published by the Japan Society of London, and a history of Japanese literature, which appeared in 1899. His last work was Shinto, The Way of the Gods, which appeared in 1905. By the way, since there are other Japan societies in the world, I prefer Japan Society of London to just calling it Japan Society, but that's purely an aside from me. J.H. Gubbins, another founding member of the Asiatic Society and Japanese secretary from 1889, was the chief negotiator of the 1894 revised treaty between Britain and Japan. His Dictionary of Chinese-Japanese Words in the Japanese language appeared in 1889. In retirement, he became a lecturer at the University of Oxford for a short period. He produced two major works on Japan, The Progress of Japan, 1853 to 1871, in 1911, and The Making of Modern Japan in 1922. I think I'm right that Gubbins never actually attended a university, so it's quite interesting that he became a lecturer at Oxford in the end, in retirement. He also produced a handbook on Japan for use at the 1919 Peace Conference. Gubbins' books received much praise when they appeared and can still be read with profit. The same cannot be said of those by his contemporary J.H. Longford, who took up a university appointment at King's College London on retirement. Footnote 16. J.E. Hoare, The Centenary of Korean-British Diplomatic Relations, Aspects of British Interest and Involvement in Korea, 1600 to 1983, Transactions of the Korea Branch, Royal Asiatic Society, Volume 58, 1983, pages 1 to 34. Footnote 17, Cornicky, William George Aston, especially pages 71 to 73. Footnote 18, Nish, John Harrington Gubbins, in I. Nish, edited, Britain and Japan Biographical Portraits, Volume 2, Richmond, Surrey, Japan Library, 1997, pages 107 to 119. And by the way, I have edited the Ernest Sato's letters to Gubbins with a foreword by J.E. Hoare, Jim Hoare. Just thought I'd mention that. All right. He, that is, who is he? I think we're still on, yes, Longford, actually. He wrote three major books, The Story of Old Japan, 1910, The Evolution of New Japan, 1913, and The Story of Korea, 1915. Well received at the time, they now seem very old-fashioned and have little more than antiquarian value. In 1916, Japanese studies moved from King's College to the new School of Oriental Studies, now School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. Longford did not transfer to the new institution, and his post came to an end. When James Murdoch died in 1922, with his History of Japan unfinished, Longford was asked to take over the production of the third volume, and apparently planned a fourth, but he too died before this could be achieved. Sato, whose reputation as a Japanese scholar remains high, by contrast published very little apart from his papers for the Asiatic Society. His nearest approach to a Japanese grammar was Kaiwa-hen. I think that's Kaiwa-hen. Anyway, Kaiwa-hen. 25 exercises in the Yedo colloquial, which appeared in 1873. I'm about to receive a reprint of that. Looking forward to receiving it in the post. One cannot help wondering if the exercises in the Yokohama dialect, produced in 1879 by the Bishop of Homoko, a red light district, was not a spoof on Sato's volume, produced by one of his fellow Japanologists. With a Japanese diplomat, he co-edited a major English-Japanese dictionary published in 1876. This continued in use in modified form until the early 1940s. Together with Lieutenant A.G.S. Hawes, that's Albert George Sidney Hawes, he published a handbook for Japan in 1881, which benefited greatly from his wide-ranging travel throughout the country. From 1884, when he moved to a diplomatic appointment in Siam, Thailand, he was busier but still managed to produce two papers for the Asiatic Society, although new interests were beginning to take over. Some of his old enthusiasm revived when he returned to Tokyo as minister in 1896, and he was president of the Asiatic Society, for which he produced his last two papers before he left for China in 1900. One of them was about bamboo, I remember. In retirement, he did little on Japan and disposed of most of his collection of Japanese books. However, he did contribute the chapter on Japan to the Cambridge Modern History series. Footnote 19, Kenrick, A Century of Western Studies of Japan, page 120. See also the contribution by Andrew Gerstle and Alan Cummings in this volume, and the introduction to James Murdoch, A History of Japan, London, Kegan Paul, Trench and Trubner, 1926, volume 3, pages 17 to 18. All right. In 1921, this is Sato, published A Diplomat in Japan, an inner history of the Japanese Reformation, based on the diaries and notes that he had kept between 1862 and 1869. It was not scholarly in the sense that it had neither notes nor bibliography, yet it remains a readable and useful guide to those turbulent years. His last great work was A Guide to Diplomatic Practice in 1917. Much modified over the years, it remains in print. Yes, I think it's now in its 8th edition. Oxford University Press. Yeah. Two consular officers carried forward the tradition of scholarship in the 1930s. One was M. Pask Smith. The other was George Sansom. Pask Smith, 1886 to 1946, joined the Consular Service in 1907 and served in a number of the more remote posts, including Manila, Taipei, and Dalian. Like Sato, Gubbins, and Sansom, he was not university educated, but he was clearly of a scholarly mind. He presented two papers to the Asiatic Society, one unpublished, a translation of Hogen Monogatari, the other in 1913, which dealt with Japanese in the Philippines in the Spanish period. His major work, Western Barbarians in Japan and Formosa in Tokugawa days, 1603 to 1858, 1930, is still widely cited. He also edited much material relating to the East India Company's interests in Japan, including a 2-volume edition of Peter Pratt's History of Japan, compiled from the record of the English East India Company, 1931, and Sir Stamford Raffles' Report on Japan to the East India Company, 1930, as well as a collection of material on the persecution of Japanese Christians at the end of the Tokugawa period and other works. Sato did study a little bit at University College London before going to Japan. I'm not sure he actually graduated. Did he graduate? I'm trying to think. No, I don't think he did. All right. Pask Smith would be seen now as an antiquarian, perhaps, rather than an historian. No such charge can be brought against Sansom, 1883 to 1965, who arrived in Japan in 1904. Not only was he a highly successful officer, winning high praise for everything that he undertook, but he also produced a series of books that have stood the test of time. Like the pioneers such as Aston and Sato, both of whom he admired, Sansom embraced Japanese culture and history as his own, which greatly helped him in what started as a hobby but would become his second career. Sansom got on well with Sir Charles Eliot, ambassador from 1919 to 1925. So, footnote number 20. Sato features prominently in Kenrick. See also P.F. Kornicki, Ernest Mason Sato, 1843 to 1929. In Kontazzi and Daniels, edited Britain and Japan, 1859 to 1991, pages 76 to 85. Bernard M. Allen, The Right Honourable Sir Ernest Mason Sato, G.C.M.G., a memoir, London, Kegan Paul, Trench and Trubner, 1933. Ian Ruxton has edited many of his letters and diaries, while former ambassador to Tokyo, Sir David Warren, plans a full-scale biography. And I believe that may be nearing publication, but anyway, I'm not not au fait with what's going on there. All right, returning to the main text, Sansom got on well with Sir Charles Eliot, ambassador from 1919 to 1925, whose secretary he was. He completed Eliot's unfinished Japanese Buddhism, which appeared in 1935. By then, Sansom had already published two major works, An Historical Grammar of Japanese, 1928, and Japan, A Short Cultural History, 1931, probably his most famous work. While still in government service, he was invited to lecture at Columbia University in New York, where he spent 6 months while on leave in 1935. His plan to retire in 1940 was thwarted by the war, which he spent in Southeast Asia before the Japanese invasion in 1941 to 1942, and then in Washington. After his retirement in 1947, he returned to Columbia as Professor of Japanese Studies. Later, he moved to Stanford University, where he worked on his 3-volume History of Japan. The Japanese Consular Service's high reputation for linguistic skills and Japanese scholarship perhaps owed more to a few bright stars than to the mass of its members. It must have been hard as a junior officer to come back from the office and begin reading Japanese for pleasure. The siren calls of sports and other outdoor activities remained strong, though some were active in both areas. Middle-ranking managers such as Sato or Gubbins might encourage the acquisition of knowledge about Japan, but senior officers were more concerned that the copying was done or the official translation completed than that a junior should shine at the meetings of the Asiatic Society. That scholar diplomats were encouraged to be knowledgeable about Japan is a myth. As one official noted in the 1930s, we did not send Mr. Pask Smith to Formosa, Taiwan, to write books. Wow, it's a powerful statement, short but pithy. Some former members of the Japan Consular Service continued to use their language skills after retirement. A number and several serving officers joined the intelligence services in both wars and in the intervening peace. Only two, Longford and Gubbins, became university lecturers. Longford's post at King's College London ended in 1916. Gubbins' post at Oxford, created for him in 1909, lasted only until 1912, since few students took the courses. So footnote 21, Ian Nish, Sir George Bailey Sansom, 1863 to 1965, Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Oxford University Press, 2004, and there is the URL, accessed 31st of January 2016. Gordon Daniels, Sir George Sansom, preeminent diplomat and historian, in Hugh Kotatsi, edited and compiled, British Envoys in Japan, 1859 to 1972, Folkestone, Kent, Global Oriental, 2004, pages 250 to 259. Returning to the main text, Gubbins' post at Oxford, created for him in 1909, lasted only until 1912, since few students took the courses he offered. Oxford did not re-establish a post in Japanese until 1954, and it was only in 1963 that teaching for a degree in Japanese began. One of the last entrants to the Japan Consular Service, Henry Sawbridge, 1907 to 1990, spent a short time as Deputy Director of the newly established Centre of Japanese Studies at the University of Sheffield, where he did some language tutoring. Military officers. It was naval officers who began to add to the meagre details of Japan known in Britain up to the mid-18th century. Before then, some information came from European publications derived from missionary accounts. Japan was known to the East India Company, but its information was not widely shared. Naval explorations added more, even if the main purpose was to aid navigation. With the opening of Japan to foreign residents after the second round of treaty-making in the late 1850s, British naval and military officers became a more permanent feature in the country. Some, such as Thomas Blakiston, had resigned their commissions before coming to Japan. Others came either as part of the British garrison at Yokohama from 1863 until 1875, or were seconded to the Japanese government. A number of these stayed on in Japan, They included F.V. Dickens, Frank Brinkley, and Lieutenant A.S.G. Hawes. Many became serious students of things Japanese, active in the Asiatic Society, and publishing books and papers on Japan. Another group were the naval officers who regularly called at Yokohama. At the first meeting of the Asiatic Society, it was Admiral Sir Charles Shadwell, Commander-in-Chief of the China Station, who drew attention to the folly of holding meetings that coincided with race days. Again, horse races. Shadwell seems to have attended on other occasions, as did his colleagues, and he was one of the earliest elected honorary members of the society. Naval officers gave papers from time to time, mostly about voyages around the Pacific. These entertained and informed the society, but were perhaps not great scholarship. They tended to appear less and less frequently as the years went by. 22. Sawbridge, Henry Raywood in Who Was Who, 1907 to 1990, page 669. Footnote 23. The Encyclopaedia Britannica, published in 1771, has 2 lines on Japan and 2 pages on Japanning, lacquer. See Volume 2, pages 826 to 828. Footnote 24. Kenrick, A Century of Western Studies of Japan, gives details. Dickens and Blakiston have Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entries. Right, next page. There was no connection between these military or ex-military scholars and the British government, which did not see the need for Japanese language training until after the signing of the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902. Once Japan assumed more importance as Britain's ally, however, it was decided that there was a need for officers who could understand Japanese and who could work alongside the Japanese military. The concept of military attachés, or military officers who would supply expert knowledge to diplomatic posts, was relatively new, but was seen as of growing importance. Such officers would need to know the languages of the countries in which they served, and this led the Army Council to seek officers for training in Japan. The first 4 left in late 1903 and the second group the following year. Between then and the outbreak of the Pacific War, around 100 officers of the British and Indian armies would learn Japanese. There were also naval officers whose course of training followed similar lines, so quite a large number of officers. Initially, officers were only to spend a year in Japan. This quickly increased to 2, and by 1910 had become 3. Some did longer, but that was exceptional. First year was spent in formal language training, at the end of which they took the same examination as consular staff. Failure meant returning to Britain. There followed an attachment to a Japanese regiment or military institution. In the early years, with the Anglo-Japanese alliance still fresh, officers found themselves well received by their Japanese counterparts. Later, they were regarded with much more suspicion, especially on the part of the police, and their movements were closely monitored. So Japan effectively became a police state, I suppose. As with the Consular Service, no particular arrangements seem to have been made for teaching. Lieutenant Calthrop, in the first group to go, had some lessons in advance from J.H. Longford. On arrival in Tokyo, Gubbins, by now Secretary of Legation, provided a list of teachers and explained what the examination required, and that was that. Lieutenant F.S.G. Piggott, another old Chiltonian, one of the second batch in 1904, who had, and then footnotes, footnote 25, see Anthony Best, British Intelligence and the Japanese Challenge in Asia, 1914 to 1941, Basingstoke, Palgrave, 2002. The Indian Army stopped sending officers for training in 1930. FSG Piggott, Broken Thread, Aldershot, Gale and Polden, 1952, page 250. And footnote 26, Sue Jarvis, Captain Oswald Tuck, RN, Royal Navy, 1876 to 1950, in Hugh Cortazzi, edited Britain and Japan Biographical Portraits, Volume 5, Folkestone, Kent, Global Oriental, 2005, pages 196 to 208. Lieutenant F.S.G. Piggott, one of the second batch in 1904, who had been partly brought up in Japan, found a teacher in the same way. Thus, the system had operated since the 1860s carried on. Most of the military students continued to live in Western style as far as possible, though there were exceptions, including Calthrop, whose language skills and knowledge of Japan benefited accordingly. He was the only officer to attend the Japanese Staff College, though even he found himself dragooned into helping with embassy amateur dramatics. Many of those who trained in Japan had successful military or naval careers. Both Calthrop and Piggott became military attaches in Tokyo, the latter twice. Calthrop might well have gone back to Japan, but he was killed in 1915. It is hard to know how many maintained their language skills after leaving. Most would have gone back to their regiments, where it would have been difficult to do so. At the outbreak of the Pacific War, few former language officers were willing to come forward as teachers, despite the urgent needs of the time. See Peter Kornicki's work. Like their consular colleagues, some became interested in Japan beyond their official duties, and they produced books and papers reflecting this. Understandably, there were many military-related publications. Even before the language scheme began, A.G. Churchill, military attaché at the time of the Boxer Uprising, so 1900, produced a dictionary of military terms, as did Calthrop, both with assistance from Japanese scholars. Calthrop, more controversially, published a translation of The Art of War, the Chinese classic study of strategy and tactics. Here he was helped by Sansom as well as by Japanese. First published as Sonshi, the Chinese military classic, in Tokyo in 1905, it reappeared as Sonshi, the Book of War, the military classic of the Far East, translated from the Chinese. Footnote 27. For Calthrop, see Hamish Ion, Something New Under the Sun, E.F. Calthrop and the Art of War, Japan Forum, Volume 2, Number 1, April 1990, pages 29 to 41. Sebastian Dobson, Lieutenant Colonel Everard Ferguson Calthrop, 1876 to 1915, in Hugh Cortazzi, compiled and edited, Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, Volume 8, Leiden Global Oriental, 2013, pages 85 to 101. For Piggott, Broken Thread, pages 24 et sec and the following. Piggott's father had been a legal advisor to the Japanese government. Carmen Blacker, two Piggotts, Sir Francis Taylor Piggott, 1852 to 1925, and Major General F.S.G. Piggott, 1883 to 1966, in Cortazzi and Daniels, Britain and Japan, pages 118 to 127. See also Anthony Best, Major General F.S.G. Piggott, 1883 to 1886, in Cortazzi, compiled and edited, Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, Volume 8, pages 102 to 116. I think Major General Piggott had quite a reputation at Cheltenham College for being an old boy with a tremendous interest in Japan. More I will not say. Excuse me. Mainly because I don't know. Footnote 28. Sadao Oba, translated Anne Kaneko, The Japanese War, Folkestone, Kent, Japan Library, 1995, pages 4 to 8. Some of those who might have been eligible were either killed or prisoners in East Asia. So let's start the last sentence of this page again. Talking about Calthrop. First published as Sonshi, the Chinese military classic, in Tokyo in 1905, it reappeared as Sonshi, the Book of War, the military classic of the Far East, translated from the Chinese, in London in 1908. This brought down the wrath of Lionel Giles, assistant curator at the British Museum and a noted scholar of Chinese, who had also translated the work. Calthrop published a number of other minor translations. That would be possibly, he would be related to the Giles who was a pioneer of Chinese at Cambridge University, I suppose. Trying to remember his full name. Piggott published the Elements of Sosho, the Japanese cursive script, in 1913, which received praise from Basil Hall Chamberlain, professor of Japanese at Tokyo Imperial University, and from George Sansom. Unlike his father, he never presented a paper to the Asiatic Society. Few military people did after 1900, but he was later active in the Japan Society of London, where he gave papers mostly of an ephemeral nature. Ephemeral as in not lasting scholarship, I suppose. During the Pacific War, Pigott was a senior lecturer at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, teaching Japanese to military and naval staff. So he did play his part there. Malcolm Kennedy, also a language officer, was invalided out of the army after the First World War. He became a businessman, then a journalist, and later a code breaker at Bletchley Park, and published several books about contemporary Japan. The naval officer Captain Oswald Tuck taught Japanese to recruits for code breaking and later contributed papers on cultural subjects to the Japan Society. But the star was Charles Boxer, 1904 to 2000, an officer in the Lincolnshire Regiment. Boxer was in Japan from 1930 to 1933. Thereafter, he specialized in intelligence work, and towards the end of the 1930s, he was in Hong Kong. Boxer had begun the study of early European contacts with Japan in his spare time in the 1920s, which led to the publication of Yan Compagnie in Japan in 1936, as well as many other works. In Hong Kong, he was at every party, but would appear next day as neat as ever, having gone home to work on another academic paper. Wonderful man. He was wounded and taken prisoner in December 1941. He left the army after the war to become Professor of Portuguese at King's College London, where he produced major works on Europe in the Age of Exploration and on Japan. In addition to his chair at King's, he spent 2 years at SOAS as Professor of the History of the Far East, 1951 to 1953, 12 years at Indiana University, and from 69 to 1972 was a professor at Yale. And Michael Cooper, whom I met briefly quite a while ago, acknowledged him as his sensei, his teacher. All right, footnote number 29, Ion, Something New Under the Sun, E.F. Calthrop and the Art of War. Footnote 30, Oba, Japanese War, page 8, Blacker, 2 Pigotts, pages 102 to 106. Footnote 31, James Cummins, Charles Boxer, 1904 to 2000, in Hugh Cortazzi, edited Britain and Japan, Biographical Portraits, London, Japan Library, 2002, pages 265 to 276. Conclusion. The work of these pioneers was important, not just in Britain. Dictionaries, grammars, and other aids to language learning were the bedrock on which Japanese studies could develop. Historical, linguistic, and legal studies, if sometimes they made little immediate impact, would be fruitful sources for more advanced studies later. Men of the Japan Consular Service and their military and naval counterparts, with their wide contacts in Japan and in the rest of the world, helped provide the basis for the courses that can now be found in many major universities. Today's students may not read Aston, Sato, or Calthrop, but they might read Gubbins, Sansom, and Boxer, and even the forgotten efforts of the pioneers can be discerned beneath contemporary works. All helped make known to the world the richness and complexity of Japan. And there are apparently, I don't think there are any footnotes on this page. No, don't think so. So, in fact, the next part is, oh, there's a blank page. All right. I think we'll stop the share here. So, that's it. I've done Jim Hoare's chapter now. There are lots of chapters in this book, and I'm not proposing to read all of them by any means. Possibly only those of people I know and who I feel I can ask their permission to read. And I thank him, Jim Hoare for allowing me to read that, and I do hope that it will meet with his approval. And with that, I think I will stop the video here, and I will see you again next time. Just before I go, over my left shoulder up here, it's a little bit blurred, but there's a portrait of Ernest Sato. Perhaps I can move the computer over to just show you. I wonder, yes, there we are. That is Ernest Sato from Spy, done by Spy for Vanity Fair in, I think, 1903, probably. when he was on leave from China. I'm pretty sure that's when it was published. Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I will stop here.